the Assistant Vice President for Research and Assessment at AAC&U. The way I describe my job right now is all value all the time, but I thought it might be helpful to give just a very, very brief background to what AAC&U is and where my work is situated within that organization. AAC&U, as you may know, stands for the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and you'll see parenthetically the way that I describe my organization, AAC&U, to my non-higher ed folks in my family and my friend group. I talk about AAC&U as a really powerful crowdsourcing organization. We look across the span of higher education, both member institutions and non-members, to see what practices are being implemented on campuses that really seem to be firing on all cylinders and promoting undergraduate success for our students. We then take that information that we've gathered through our crowdsourcing and translate them into what we hope are useful resources that individual faculty, teams at campuses crossing the curricular and co-curricular, academic leadership, presidents and provosts can actually take these tools and use them to implement good practices on their own campuses. We are an organization that really loves acronyms. It's probably a byproduct of being based in Washington, D.C. And the two that are most pertinent to our conversation today are LEAP and VALUE. As you may know, LEAP stands for Liberal Education and America's Promise. It was the signature initiative kicked off in 2005, a 10-year initiative to take us to the centennial 2015 of AAC&U's founding. With the idea that what we mean by liberal education, not focused just on the liberal arts, not just focused on the humanities, but the broad span of equality education for all of our students, including both general education as well as the majors, breadth and depth, what happens inside the classroom and then what happens outside. Out of the LEAP initiative, that is where we generated our list of ELOs, or essential learning outcomes. Those of you who do gen ed work and assessment in the great state of Texas are probably familiar with that list, because many of your core competencies from the state will map directly onto that list. The question then came after having that list, well, how do we assess some of these things? And my boss and friend and mentor, Terry Rhodes, helped spearhead the creation of what we're here to talk about today, the value approach to assessment. VALUE standing for Valid Assessment of Learning in Undergraduate Education, most well known for the suite of 16 rubrics that go along with that. So here's just a quick visual on what I see AAC&U's role being. Everything that we talk about in terms of things like high impact practices, guided learning pathways, signature work, the value rubrics, it is really important, and we talk about these in probably a distinct way. We don't claim to have invented these things, but rather to have helped bring them to the fore for campuses as a way of organizing your thinking and understanding which practices seem to help our students succeed more than others. All of these practices, in addition to being found on various campuses and having really practical, pragmatic research behind them from AAC&U, can be tied back to a lot of the peer-reviewed educational research on what works, from the learning sciences to student development theory. And then what I really see the role of my office is helping to do is really further taking this work further from our translations to then help campuses mirror back to others who are asking questions about the quality and value of an educational experience on their campus, to be able to provide some answers through authentic direct assessment, curricular mapping, that sort of thing. So hopefully that gives you a little bit, if you're not familiar with the work of my office in particular, or AAC&U more broadly, a little bit of a grounding in the work that we have. But today, to talk about value and get into the weeds of value methodologically, I thought it was really important to talk about the broader landscape for a moment of higher education and assessment of student learning within higher education today. We work, in tandem, in complementary ways with a lot of great organizations in higher ed. One of them you may be familiar with is the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, known by their acronym NILOA. And every year or two, they do a survey of chief academic officers on campuses around assessment practices. And one of the most, I think, significant findings that we are seeing from their most recent report, which was released the beginning of last year, January 2018, is that they're seeing a trend line moving towards what we're calling authentic measures of student learning. So basically things that are coming out of and from programs, the curricula on campuses, actual classrooms, whether it's an FYE or a capstone experience, and then the assignments, the work products, the e-portfolios are often then being considered from a measurement perspective in tandem with a rubric, value or otherwise. This is a significant thing when we look at the trajectory of assessment practice over the last decade, where, certainly when I finished my PhD and jumped kind of, 2 feet into the deep end of assessment at a campus, there was a really heavy push for the exclusive use of multiple choice tests, standardized tests that were commercially available, many of them leveraging that pre-post, quote unquote, value added statistical operation to try to drill down and see, numerically, statistically, what could we attribute to an individual institution in terms of student learning. I should say from the beginning, I'm not an anti-test or anti-standardized test person. That being said, I think that, the tool has to fit the task, and often where those instruments come up short is in our ability to connect the dots back from the data we receive, the results that we see on those tests, to the actual lived experiences of faculty and students as part of the curriculum. If the idea behind assessment is that we're making changes to try to improve student success, the student experience, undergraduate teaching and learning, if you can't take something and walk it back to know what changes to make, it becomes more of an intellectual exercise as opposed to a robust assessment activity. So, what we were seeing through this survey that NILOA conducted was not only this trend, but then actually respondents articulating that they were privileging the kinds of measures on their campuses that faculty found most relevant. And I think that's a really important sea change in the culture around assessment. The acknowledgement that if you do not have something that your faculty see as valid, that your assessment efforts may not be as successful or fruitful as you would want them to be. This notion that it's not just simply to answer external calls for accountability. Again, just a movement in the culture and the understanding at the leadership level around what assessment is and what it can be. Because behind that notion of authentic assessment are several assumptions or, very explicit purposes that we're trying to achieve. As I mentioned previously, just the fact that you would have results that you can actually use that are linked more closely with teaching and learning, that alone is a critical component, and one of the reasons why I think things like value have resonance across different groups and audiences on a campus. We are talking about, with authentic assessment, whether you use a value rubric or not, using sources of evidence of student learning that are already integral to teaching. If we trust faculty to design assignments that are supposed to help an individual student learn in the course, in a particular course as part of their program, I think we should trust that those assignments provide potential assessment data around that learning that we can look at in the aggregate at the program level, looking for patterns. What we hope is that by using measures of student learning that faculty have had ownership in creating, that faculty see as valid and reliable from their best estimation, as strategies for helping students begin to develop content knowledge, procedural knowledge, advanced higher order skills and abilities, that hopefully conversations around assessment will be less of an add-on and be more really part of the regular pedagogical work that they would be engaging in. True, talking about, alignment between an assignment and a particular rubric or value rubric, there may be tweaking and work involved there. It's not to say that there's not any additional work, but that the effort that would go into that kind of assessment activity would indeed be of value to the faculty who are generously providing student work samples from their courses. And then finally, the idea here is that because of all of the above, faculty would be more engaged and generatively engaged, not just buying in and acquiescing, but generatively engaged in the assessment process when it comes to student learning on their campus. So, as we move forward, I would just want to have you thinking about how you're using rubrics and student work in your assessment, and keep in mind what is working for you and what challenges you've encountered, maybe even jot those down. On a scrap piece of paper, because what I hope is once we do a little bit of the methodological data geek dive into value, which is kind of the bread and butter of my office, that we can either help alleviate some of your challenges or think through strategies so that by the end of this webinar, maybe you have a few more tricks in the bag in terms of implementing something like the value approach on your campus. And if not, just also provides us good fodder for conversation, because I certainly hope to have plenty of time at the end for you to ask questions and poke at anything that I've said. Okay, so very quickly, just a little bit of level setting. What's a rubric anyway, and what is a value rubric? I always kind of laugh because I started in K through 12 as a high school social studies teacher, and I can tell you that in 1997 when I started, they were using rubrics. And I'm sure faculty at colleges and universities in certain disciplines, immediately I think of, rhetoric and composition, communications, we're using rubrics. But I just love this quote that I found when I was working on a lit review for an article, is the notion that rubrics are all the rage these days, and it's difficult to attend an educational conference without running into the relentless support for the educational payoffs of rubrics. I would say AAC&U has probably contributed some of the noise that this might be expressing, over the last decade, certainly. But I think that what's really important is to initially frame what we mean by a rubric and what is a rubric's ultimate purpose. And I will tell you that even as we are looking at it from AAC&U's perspective as a vehicle for assessment at the programmatic level, we certainly do not think of rubric as the equivalent of an accountability tool. Instead, I would argue that a rubric is really a pedagogical innovation that has assessment and accountability potential. Because if it's not meaningfully integrated into our conceptions of teaching and learning and what we're doing as strategies in the classroom to get our students processing, so if we're not thinking about rubrics from an instructional design perspective, it's just one of those things we kind of add on at the end. My argument is you're going to get the same kind of results you would get by just throwing some commercially available test at students at the end as well, where there's a big disconnect. So with this notion of value and the value rubrics really being a pedagogical vehicle first and accountability tools second, let's talk a little bit about the approach. So many of you may know that value is celebrating its 10th anniversary in 2019. The release of the original value rubrics happened in 2009. They were the result of an 18-month development period where teams of faculty and co-curricular professionals, librarians, Center for Teaching and Learning directors worked on 16 separate value rubric teams for each of the essential learning outcomes that dealt with intellectual skills and abilities, personal and social responsibility, dispositions, that sort of thing. For each rubric, the teams developed core characteristics, criteria, what we call now dimensions of learning for each outcome, and then delineated the performance levels. I think it's really important to know here that these teams were highly interdisciplinary and they were cross-sector. You had faculty and academic professionals from 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions, public, private, liberal arts to research ones to regional comprehensives. The idea was also that you not have any one discipline own a particular outcome. So there was that interdisciplinary spread very intentionally in terms of the composition of each of the teams. And then after the original rubrics were created, they were vetted both by the campuses that had participated in the development, as well as some core LEAP campuses that volunteered to test them on their own campuses. So there was some beta testing before they were released into the wild of higher education. The urban legend that I have heard at AAC&U is that once the final versions of the rubrics were available, and Terry Rhodes walked them into our then president's office, Dr. Carol Gary Schneider, a historian by training, is that she initially picked up a pen to start revising one of the rubrics, and Terry very politely, if not forcefully, removed the pen from her hand and said, no, this is not AAC&U creating these things. We were the stewards of this process. So what you see, pluses, minuses, everything is what was developed by each of those teams. And we really tried to stay true to the idea that these were faculty developed. In front of you, you just have the list of the value rubrics that are currently available. You will see several of them underlined. Those are the rubrics that are actually part of the new Value Institute, where campuses can participate by sending in samples of their own student work to be scored by calibrated, certified value scorers, faculty from other campuses. The ones available include civic engagement, critical thinking, ethical reasoning, global learning, intercultural knowledge and competence, quantitative literacy, and written communication. We're soliciting feedback, and some of it has been unsolicited, but it has been incredibly helpful about which ones to try to bring online in the Value Institute next. But that's what you're looking at for the moment. But as you see, the rubrics cover outcomes, some of which, honestly, there are some good other alternative measures out there. There are some very robust critical thinking tests that are available. And certainly for quantitative literacy, that's another example that comes to mind. And as I've always said, assessment isn't about finding the silver bullet measure. It's about multiple measures and triangulation. But then there are others on this list for which I would make the argument that there are, if they exist, they're not as robust in terms of, standardized tests or survey instruments. In that, if you're asking about issues around ethical reasoning, for example, civic engagement in terms of behaviors, those are hard to capture on closed-ended, on instruments with closed-ended responses. You have issues of social desirability, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the call with value was recognizing the totality of all the outcomes that higher education was attempting to inculcate and foster with undergraduate students. And if we only went with those outcomes for which we had existing tests, we would really be narrowing our focus and our missions as institutions. If you haven't seen one, just a quick visual of what we'll be talking about when we talk about the rubrics. I think one of the most overlooked resources is actually the cover page that accompanies each analytical rubric, that is the value rubric. It gives you first and foremost the learning outcome, the operational definition, but then the two sections towards the bottom, framing language and glossary, are hidden gems in the value approach. The language, the framing language and the glossary sections were created by the teams that actually drafted and put forward the original rubrics. And essentially what it does is give you a window into their thinking. One of the challenges we know when it comes to using rubrics, especially if you have multiple scorers, is trying to get everybody on the same page. What does the rubric mean by XYZ? Well, the glossary for each of the rubrics will tell you specifically what those who wrote the rubric were thinking. The framing language is also super helpful because it tells you in many ways what kinds of assignments or work products would fit best with that particular rubric. My personal lived example of this is when we implemented the information literacy rubric at Virginia Tech as part of our QEP back in 2010. I made the mistake of not actually realizing that some traditional information literacy assignments like an annotated bibliography on its own wouldn't really work as well information literacy as a value rubric really describes a process and wants to understand the process that the students used adjudicating sources, selecting them, determining credibility, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get a standard annotated bibliography, in the end, what you're getting is a finished product of the sources the students picked, but we don't know how they got there. Versus, for example, the inquiry and analysis rubric, which says very specifically, it is not a rubric for assessing an undergraduate research process, but instead it would be perfectly suited for assessing the end product of an undergraduate research experience. So again, if you're using them and you've skipped over this or haven't printed it and shared it with folks, I think this is something to go back to. You'll see here just the picture of what I think most people think of when they think of a rubric. We, again, have the definition there. We have performance levels, the dimensions of how the outcome has been operationalized down the left-hand column. Say one of the nuances that it's always funny when I go on a campus, I often have folks say to me, oh, well, don't worry, we fixed the value rubric. We switched the order of the performance levels, because it does feel a little counterintuitive for most to start at 4 on the left and work your way down to 1 versus starting at 1 and working your way up to 4, leading left to right. We'll talk about the reason behind that in a minute, but I just want to assure you it wasn't actually a mistake. It was intentional. Using these tools, by using them, you're actually implicating several value assumptions that are still foundational to the approach, even as value has evolved and grown. The notion that student work is the best representation of students' motivated learning is critical. Students are at least as motivated to do well on that particular assignment as they are in that class for a grade. It has meaning, it has relevance to the degree that they would see that within the course. That translates as part of a measurement tool. What we are trying to do here is focus on what the student can do in terms of key dimensions of a learning outcome, and really the quality of what students are doing, the quality of that performance is really up to faculty and educator expert judgment. As you may know, the value approach came out of a very specific political context. Margaret Spellings, the then Secretary for Education for George W. Bush, and the person who helped bring forward No Child Left Behind for K through 12, was working on what she called the future of higher education and brought together a commission to recommend, issues and strategies for assuring quality in undergraduate education. And, the conclusion of that study was essentially that students graduating should all have to take one of 3 multiple choice tests to demonstrate that they had learned something. And within that report, we had a board member at AAC&U once do a count, and he shared with me that in a 400-page report, faculty were only mentioned twice. And that alone, it just felt like an anathema to what not only AAC&U represented, but the diversity of higher education and what we do. We, again, trust faculty to teach students. Faculty and educator expert judgment needs to be part of the evaluation of the outcomes of that teaching and learning experience. As I mentioned before, that notion that results must be useful and actionable, and then ultimately what we want to be able to do, and you'll hear AAC&U folks talk a lot about moving away from the mean, so to speak, the global mean, is really being able to look at our data in a way that raises up and does not wash out the diversity that we have on our campuses, be it racial, ethnic, socioeconomic status, but also diversity of our courses, credit levels, disciplinary backgrounds, so that we can get a more nuanced understanding of what students are able to do. So while the rubrics or value is pretty much synonymous in most people's thinking with the rubrics themselves, it's really critical if we're going to talk about method and we're going to talk about whether or not value is reliable and valid, that we acknowledge that as an approach, value is pretty complex epistemologically, pedagogically, and methodologically, because what we're really talking about is the interplay, the interrelationship between 3 distinct separate entities. So we've got the value rubrics, which give us that 1, 2, 3, 4 range for scores, and the performance descriptors that are supposed to guide us into assessing student learning. But what we're looking at is assessing the output of an assignment. So the assignment, how it's designed, what it asks students to do, what it doesn't ask students to do. Our understanding of assignments is critical to our understanding of the value approach, as well as the scores themselves. And so, a lot of time and attention is spent on trying to enhance faculty training and understanding of the rubrics, getting folks on the same page from a calibration perspective. And all of these pieces have their own complex moving parts within them that we have to kind of corral and ascertain as we start talking about value as a big picture thing. So, when it comes to our expert faculty scores, what we really are trying to do within our training session is two things. One, the notion that we're calibrating faculty to reach a consensus score. When we do our trainings for our Value Institute, the nationwide level, we have anchor assignments that some of our more expert scorers have already looked at and adjudicated and assigned scores to. So not only are we trying to get everybody to a score, we're trying to get them to the most correct score. But beyond that, what's one of the most interesting things to emerge from our research is that the trainings themselves are really rich faculty development opportunities. And when we say faculty, we think big tent, big picture. And it's everyone from, from graduate students, contingent, full-time instructors, all the way to tenure track from any type of institution. And again, certainly bringing in the co-curricular as well. The scoring that we engage our faculty in are really, the methodology for training is really designed to reflect an asset-based versus deficit-focused approach to assessing student learning. That's actually the primary reason you see the number 4 on the left, where when we train folks, we say to everyone, you really need to give your students the benefit of the doubt and assume that they have the ability and the potential to be delivering a 4-level piece of work for this dimension to you. And when you don't see evidence, then you move down to the 3. And if you don't see evidence there, then you move down to the 2, etc. The reason for doing this, as I said, is really to start to have scores be immediately oriented to the notion of the learning that is possible for the students, as well as to disrupt a little bit of our tendencies that may be part of our grading practices that are slightly different from what we need to do for an assessment perspective. So that tells you a little bit about what goes into the faculty and the scorer piece in addition to the rubrics. The other third circle of that diagram is the assignment. And so, we just have to be truthful and transparent when we say, yes, the assignment matters, and we need to focus on assignment design and alignment. Because I will make the argument and have made the argument with a colleague of mine that many, and I'll say possibly most of our rubric problems are not methodological but pedagogical, in the sense that what we really need is that if we're using things out of the classroom to generate meaningful information, all aspects of the classroom experience must align pedagogically: the outcomes, the course content, the learners, the instructional and performance context, and the strategies that we're using. In shorthand, in other words, assessment must be related to the what, who, and the how of teaching and learning. And that's where we have found some of the more interesting work and interesting partnerships with places like NILOA that do work on assignment design, is that, yes, there are things we may want to revise about the rubrics, but rather than focusing on making the rubric the sole focus of any changes, part of what we need to do is shift our attention to assignment and assignment design. And I need to be very clear here that when we talk about assignments with value, there's no such thing as a good or bad assignment. It's really just about alignment with the particular rubric. You can have an amazing assignment that does everything it is intended to do pedagogically and fires on all cylinders for your students, but if you use the wrong rubric to assess it for a student learning perspective, you may just get some bad data. It may look like your students achieved nothing on that outcome, when in reality, it just was a bad fit. And that's part of what we're seeing in some of our nascent work on assignment design out of AAC&U. What we have found, there's some nuances, that just taking an upper division course doesn't necessarily guarantee that all of the assignments are equally demanding. That students, this will be shocking to no one who's taught a class, often calibrate their effort. If they're asked to do less, they do less because that's what the assignment asked of them. What we think part of the implication of focusing on assignment design is that this can be potentially a relatively inexpensive way of helping promote learning across all student populations, because we know that for high impact practices, for example, not every student has an equal opportunity, be it for cost or time, program constrictions, etc., to take advantage of high impact practices. But that being said, I also want to make a point here that as far as we're concerned, just calling it high impact does not make it so. And even within a high impact practice, there are elements of needing to focus on assignment design. There's another excellent article in Change Magazine a few months ago by Carol Trossett, and Stephen Weisler, that interrogated the output of senior theses. So in addition to looking at the direct measure of student learning from the thesis, they also had students and faculty complete surveys. Students were asked to gauge their own, assess their own kind of self-efficacy when it came to completing the assignment. And one of the interesting takeaways is that Trossett and Weisler found that there was a total absence of any relationship between the rubric scores, the direct measure of student learning, and student satisfaction with their own work, which the authors argue suggests to us that many students may not be learning enough about how to recognize quality work and demand it of themselves. To me, that's another reason why rubrics are such a fabulous pedagogical tool to help make learning visible, not just for assessment purposes, but for that teaching and learning, that self-regulation and metacognition that we know is critical for our students to be successful moving on. Okay, so now that I've told you how complex this is, I want to spend a little time talking about what this means from a methods perspective, because establishing the validity and reliability of value is a key priority for AAC&U. I've been there almost 4 years now, and it has been part of my I'd say my dominant job responsibilities since starting back in 2015. And as we move forward, I think that this is really fertile ground for taking value to the next level. But some of the basic questions that we have to wrestle with is just, first determining what kind of tool a value rubric is. This is one of my favorite screens to put up when I'm doing a workshop and just take a temperature check of the room and ask if the value rubrics are quantitative or qualitative. And it's interesting to see where people shake out, and there's good conversations that always result from, what counts, why a department would want to call it quantitative, what that meant from faculty engagement, why another discipline or department would rail against the notion that it's quantitative and talk qualitative. My flippant answer when we kind of wrap up the discussion and they say, well, which is it, is, well, who cares? Not from the perspective of being methodologically loosey-goosey, but from the perspective of how is this tool best leveraged for you individually in teaching, learning, and assessment? How we need to recognize that, the tool itself lends itself to both quantitative and qualitative consideration. So when we speak methodologically, folks want to know, is it reliable? Is it valid? The semi-equivalent terms or considerations from a qualitative perspective is, we're talking about credibility, transferability, confirmability, dependability also, certainly has a quantitative connotation. And so what I would say to everyone as we start taking a deeper dive into the methods piece of what we now can say 10 years later, is that the caveat is always going to be that comparing value to standardized tests will always be an apples to oranges proposition. That being said, attending to issues of validity and reliability and really interrogating those and understanding what value allows us to do, and then where the limitations of the value approach rest, will give campuses better information as they're trying to determine if this is an approach that will work, in what context, when, and how. So what I'm going to talk about now is based on data that we've been collecting since 2014 and through our Value Institute. You know, we had multiple grant-funded collaboratives that allowed us to collect a great deal of student work, assignments, as well as feedback from over 400 faculty scorers when we've done follow-ups with surveys around their experiences, their feedback on the rubrics, etc. And what we know is that the folks who've engaged with us highly say that, you know, really positive things have come out of doing this work with the rubrics, that it's helped faculty members have a shared vocabulary that they then can give to students when it comes to helping students understand that differentiation of levels of learning, that, you know, it helped in many instances with cultural change where the value approach was no longer seen as a policing of faculty practices, but really the foundation for faculty themselves to own the process. And then, as I said earlier, that notion of assignments really mattering, that assignments themselves have an important role to play in student learning and assessing that learning. What I'm going to talk about for the next maybe 8 minutes is also available in multiple sources. So I want to highlight those for you and tell you which ones are free and which ones you have to purchase so that you can revisit some of these ideas in greater detail if that's of interest to you. The first is a free PDF report on solid ground where we shared the results from the first 2 years of the Value Initiative. This is really the first place that, and I was a co-author on this, the first place where I think AAC&U put some stakes in the ground around the AAC&U way of, number one, thinking about what kind of data value generates, how to describe it, what displays you will see us use, how will we present the data, what kind of statistics will we run on the data, what won't we do with the data, etc. And that's not to say that it's prescriptive and that you only can do what we recommend there, but just so that everyone would have an idea of what AAC&U was going to do from a practice perspective. And then, you know, certainly campuses can make their own decisions around what to do. Another free resource, if you go to our website, is our most recent issue of Peer Review, one of our glossy magazines. And there are pieces from multiple campuses around method issues when it comes to value. I'm going to highlight one of those a little later on. And then finally, our most comprehensive articulation of the validity and reliability of value is our publication. We have a rubric for that, the Value Approach to Assessment. I want to say that if your campus is a member institution, it's maybe $15, maybe $20. I apologize, I don't remember off the top of my head. But this literally walks through the interpretive argument for value around validity and dealing with all of the assumptions associated with value as an approach. Because, you know, it's important for us to do this because there are a lot of people taking shots at assessment these days. There have been a lot of things in the Chronicle of late, certainly in Inside Higher Ed last week. There's another piece about a really interesting panel at the WASC, the Western Association annual meeting, which, you know, I wish I had been a fly on the wall there to participate in that. But, you know, we recognize at AAC&U that, you know, there is a need for us to really interrogate what we're doing and, when necessary, to bring in you know, critical friends who don't get their paycheck from AAC&U per se to take a look at the data as well. Because the Value Initiative's research, as one scholar wrote, can contribute to a revolution in assessment, or it can just be used to justify the continuation of ineffective practices. The outcome will really depend on value leadership and our willingness to critically analyze what we're doing. That's the final article by David Eubanks. If you're an assessment person, you probably know David from the listserv, talking about addressing the assessment paradox. You know, when David and I first started chatting about value as a method, one of the things he said to me was, I really worry about a tautology that would be, you know, something along the lines of value has been established as valid. Therefore, if I use value, I am doing valid assessment. And we know that there are so many design elements that go into implementing any assessment tool. that we, as the purveyors of a tool, have to be really circumspect and appropriate in what we recommend and how we help campuses actually build capacity to use this, to its fullest ability, but not overreach, not get over our skis on what we can say. One of the questions that always comes up is about generalizability and at what level can we compare scores from one institution to another, et cetera. And we can talk a little bit after I've run through some of this if people have questions about our approach to that. I mean, AAC&U is not in the business of ranking and never has been and never will be, but that notion of benchmarking can be a helpful conversation to have. But one of the pieces that I love in that value peer review issue is from a gentleman named John Hathcote at James Madison University, who is part of CARS, their Center for Assessment and Research Studies, which has contributed a great deal over the last 2 decades, if not 3 decades, to our thinking around assessment and also to the development of, relatively robust tests that, folks often use as part of gen ed assessment. John asks, what do we learn about a chef? His article compares assessment to Hell's Kitchen with Chef Gordon Ramsay. So it's actually one of the best methods pieces I've ever read that is completely digestible and entertaining. I wish I had been able to write this myself. But he says, what do we learn about a chef when they are asked to create a signature dish? The signature dish does not provide information about what a chef will typically produce. Instead, the signature dish is an indication of what is possible by providing insight into what a chef is capable of creating. His analogy then goes on, in higher education, senior capstone projects and specific forms of e-portfolios are analogous to a chef's signature dish since the product illustrates what a student can create. In other words, the issue of generalization virtually dissipates once we change our focus from what is typical to what is possible. When assessing student performance, there tends to be tension between competing values of generalization and directness. There is not an easy solution to this issue, though I remain optimistic about our ability to confront this problem. Again, highly recommend that article in particular. But to hit some of the highlights, and then certainly recommend that you're more than welcome to go back and look at the publications that I mentioned. What can I say to you around the questions? Is value reliable? Is it valid? And what about the assignments? So what I would say first and foremost is we're incredibly excited about the level of inter-rater reliability that we were able to achieve in the last scoring sessions. We use several different tests, and they're, again, available online. We've looked at, weighted exact percent agreement range. We've looked at weighted Cohen's kappa, Brennan-Prediger, as well as Gwetz AC. And there's good reasons for looking at things, for using Brennan-Prediger or Gwetz AC in terms of accounting for the kind of tool we're using, distance between the scores. And what we're seeing is that for critical thinking, written communication, moderate to, highly moderate to almost high inter-rater reliability, ranging from, on Gwetz AC, for example, written communication 0.6 to 0.84, critical thinking 0.64 to 0.7. Quantitative literacy, there's a little more variation, a little more variability in our ranges, with some rows not functioning as well as others. But, the great thing about that is, we're 10 years in, and these rubrics are now, our goal is to look at the rubrics in terms of revisions, and a lot of that data by dimension can tell us which rows may be rows that we want to tackle first. Should we then revise them to make them more robust when it comes to a reliability perspective? When it comes to the validity, as I said, that publication, we have a rubric for that, goes into an interpretive argument that drills down into claims regarding claims and assumptions around the value rubric design and development, claims and assumptions associated with the rubric application, score interpretation and use. I think we have a really strong argument that these are valid tools that have been taken up by an incredible number of institutions as well as individual faculty and practitioners. I think that part of the conversation is that notion of, is it valid in relation to things like the assignment? So part of our work now around the assignments, particularly if you're participating in the Value Institute, is to try to get some more nuanced information from faculty regarding their intentions around the assignments. So now, for example, when faculty submit an assignment and student work to be scored by with us, we ask them by dimension, did you or did you not intend for this assignment to address this dimension specifically? We also ask for assignment weight on the syllabus. We know our students are really good at calibrating effort, and that their effort for an assignment that counted as maybe 5% versus, a signature assignment that counted for 40% of their semester grade, they might calibrate and perform differently, based on time and effort on those particular assignments. So it's a bit of a proxy for that. The other thing we are now asking of faculty is to share with us what they see as the assignment difficulty or overall purpose of the assignment. And there we have very purposefully borrowed language from the world of curricular mapping. So was this assignment intended to introduce the content and the outcome versus practice something they've seen before versus reinforce something that they have had previous opportunities to get to practice and get feedback upon, or is this really something that is at the mastery level, as part of a capstone course in terms of faculty expectation? Because for us, in terms of maintaining the validity of the value approach, we really are engaging in a careful balancing act. And what you see here is a display that roughly tries to visualize what it is we will privilege and what we won't. And from a methodological perspective, there are two important stakes in the ground that I want to reiterate as part of this conversation. That, what we're talking about is making sure that no matter what we do, epistemologically, philosophically, pedagogically, faculty autonomy and expertise and academic freedom are not only accounted for, but expected and welcomed as part of the design element. We're looking at, curricular alignment issues here, helping, make sure that the assignments actually align with the outcomes, which are part of the curriculum, et cetera. And that this approach really provides developmental opportunities as well, as opposed to getting strict around certain parameters. So the two stakes in the ground that are possible avenues for us to enhance certain aspects of our inter-rater reliability, for example, or our generalizability, would be to change up what we're doing methodologically. Gary Pike, who's a wonderful colleague, he's faculty at Indiana University, had been at Indiana University, IUPUI, before schools of education were kind of reorganized there. And Gary did a great dependability study for us that's actually in that peer review issue. And part of the conversation I had with Gary afterwards when we were going over the results, he said, one thing you could do is require that everyone use a common prompt. And that was, in his write-up for us, in his report. So the idea would be to get your work scored on the value rubric, you should use, one of these 5 assignments or one of these 5 prompts. And that's what everyone would be scored to. So from a training and calibration perspective, certainly that would make life easier in terms of achieving inter-rater reliability, because we're only talking about, a finite number of possibilities when it comes to what student work would look like. But, to be honest, that's such a violation of why value was started in one of our foundational assumptions about taking real assignments out of the classroom, that's not a direction we're ever going to go. And so we just have to acknowledge that and work to enhance inter-rater reliability by, looking forward to possibly revising some of the rubrics enhancing training, but then also doubling down on the notion of what does a well-aligned assignment look like. So moving forward, AAC&U is hopeful that we'll be able to provide some examples that have come from the field, that have scored highly from an assignment perspective when it comes to a particular rubric. Not to say that everyone should do this assignment, but here are the elements that were included and why this was well aligned. Another thing to be mindful of is that when the value rubrics were originally designed, the idea was never that they would be used to assess a single assignment, although that's been the majority of the practice thus far, but that they would be leveraged to look at an iterative assignment, so an assignment in pieces over a semester, like a capstone or signature work, or more explicitly a portfolio of student work, like an e-portfolio. One of the other things that we have been told is that we could potentially enhance the reliability of our scores if we move to something called machine scoring, and actually having computer-aided or computer-run scoring of the assignments, the student work products. And again, that's just not something that we're going to do. We're holding that notion of faculty development and faculty engagement, generative engagement in assessment as sacrosanct to the value approach. So we're not going to be sending our things for machine scoring anytime soon. So with that, I can stop and hopefully take some questions, open it up for some discussion before you all have to get off to the rest of your busy day. Again, point to some resources or just open it up to whatever makes the most sense for you all.
Kate, I'm not sure you can hear me.
I got you, Larry.
Okay, and I'm not sure if everyone else can hear me, but in the chat box, if you don't have audio, you can put your questions in the chat box. There is a question there now from Elizabeth Giddings. I don't know if you can see it, Kate. It says, does AAC&U plan on offering mass video training for instructors if for free or purchase?
So that's a great question. We are currently, so first of all, right now, all of our training on rubric calibration is available for free. We have moved from doing in-person training. I will say we often do get asked to come and do what I would call mock calibration sessions or do training on campuses. And I know that can be both time intensive and labor intensive and resource intensive for campuses, but that is one option. The other option is that our official training that has actually just started today is right now freely available, asynchronous. It's done through the Canvas learning management system that some of you might actually have on your own campuses. And it is not required that, if you complete the training, you are not required to then score for us within the Value Institute. But we do hope that many people will. And if people do then follow up and score for the Value Institute, there's a small honorarium that goes along with that. I will say that the training fills up quickly. We have, I think, 400 individuals registered already and who are beginning the training for critical thinking, written communication, and quantitative literacy right now. Because of the summer scoring we hope to do for the Value Institute, but recognizing that answer in that time frame may not help you, Elizabeth, or anyone else who's looking at thinking about this at this particular moment, feel free to send me an email and we can always just hop on the phone and you can tell me, kind of what you're trying to do, what your timeline is, and, we can see what the possibilities are. I will say that as AAC&U has started scaling this work, we've had more and more demands for training. At some point, there may be a nominal fee associated. I always want to be really transparent. There may be a nominal fee associated with that just to cover the cost of, platform use and that kind of thing. But that is still way under discussion. It's not anything that's been implemented or decided upon yet. But that may be in the offing in the next few years, but right now it's still something that we do for free.
Another question is, has AAC&U seen a decrease in institutional participation in the Value Institute with the switch to the institutional payment model?
So we certainly did see a bit of a decrease from the multi-state collaborative process. So over the 3 years of the multi-state and the 2 smaller collaboratives, there was a total of 92 institutions that participated. We never had that many in any one single year, and there was, schools that kind of opted in and opted out. I think the last year of the collaboratives, I want to say we had about 58 participants. The first year of the Value Institute as a fee for service was last year, and we had, I believe it was about 25, and this year we have currently subscribed and enrolled 40 institutions. So the numbers are going in a positive direction. What we talk about in terms of benchmarking is really, we're building what I'll call a landscape of learning, so to speak. And it's going to take, particularly for some outcomes, a longer period of time for there to be what I would consider robust landscape benchmarking data. The big 3, for example, critical thinking, written communication, and quantitative literacy a little bit behind critical thinking and written communication. Those are the most frequently subscribed outcomes within the Value Institute. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think they're relatively, in the grand scheme of things, relatively easy outcomes to find assignments for, and assignments that could possibly come from across the span of disciplines that you have on a campus. Almost every faculty member I know talks about doing critical thinking in their classroom. It may be that the rubric, or the assignment needs a little bit of tweaking to align more specifically with value, but generally speaking, there's a lot of fodder for those outcomes on our campuses. Some of the other outcomes that are kind of small but mighty that people are moving forward with, global learning in particular, intercultural knowledge and competence. The ability to benchmark there will take a little bit longer, just based on the number of folks who subscribe to that. But we're positive about it, and we've been able to this year. What I would say is kind of front load the costs with one outcome. The pricing model used to be $6,000 for one, and then $4,000 for each additional. And we've been able to reduce that with some efficiencies down to $3,000 for additional outcomes in the same academic year, mainly because of system and platform costs that are associated with getting institutions kind of set up. And once you've done the setup, the additional outcome is less of a lift from a resource perspective. So that's where the pricing stands now. And again, there's information very specifically about participating in that on the website. And any questions you can certainly direct to me or to our Value Institute at aacu.org email address.
Are there any more questions from anyone? If you have a question, please type it in the chat box.
Well, thank you everyone again for letting me at least hit the highlights when it comes to some of the work that we've done methodologically. And at the risk of self-promotion, and I apologize, I certainly don't mean it in that way, some of the feedback we've gotten on we have a rubric for that publication has just been that it is a really handy desk reference to have to answer questions or concerns that come up if you are someone who is, partially responsible for taking the notion of value around to others to see if they are interested and willing to participate in a value approach. I think On Solid Ground also gives you a lot of that for free. It's having those in tandem, though they're written in a way that hopefully you can pull out what you need from those publications to answer questions and some of the questions that you might be getting repeatedly from different audiences. So I hope this has been helpful and it has at least piqued folks' interest in this type of work around value. We are also, as I said, very interested in hearing about your perspectives on questions or concerns or, what if ... So any ideas you have when it comes to testing out value and making value more robust, please don't ever hesitate to ping me. My email, I know Larry's going to have these slides and a recording of this. My email is at the front. It's just simply my last name, McConnell@AAC&U.org. And I know many of you are my friends on Twitter. So you will never hurt my feelings when you are sending us ideas that can help make this work more for campuses and enhance the robustness of what we're trying to do. So please don't hesitate to chime in whatever way makes sense to help us make this better.
Thank you, Kate. We appreciate you doing this webinar for us today. And as Kate said, this will be recorded. It's been recorded, and I will distribute the link for that recording as soon as possible. So again, thank you, Kate, and we appreciate you sharing this information with us today.
Anytime. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.